Greetings, fellow humanoids, and welcome back to the Versal Plane, home to all manner of magical mayhem. This evening's eclectic collection of characters includes me, the one and only once and future Cap without a country, on my own and by myself as I wander the wonderful world of solo RPG in this third installment of Table for One. I continue my adventure in Max Moon's 12 years, picking up where we left off, following the deaths of the twin brothers Horace and Phineas Manning, who had ventured into the jagged ridges of the Adiamone Hills and descended into a subterranean complex where they confronted a demonic entity within the deepening darkness of an old dining hall. Phineas brandishes his battle axe, and Horace raises his quarterstaff, and a fiendish, disfigured face with a pair of serrated horns curving up and back from its forehead grins out of the swirling shadows at them. Horace strikes at the figure with reckless speed, grazing it before the darkness curls around him almost delicately. Then it tightens around his throat until he starts to scream, and as he does, a surge of smoke and ash rushes into his mouth. He goes immediately silent and seizes up, shuddering as he rises up off the floor for a moment, and then he collapses to the stones as the shadows retreat from him, dragging with them a faint, horrifically familiar mist that twists and twitches before snapping free from his throat. A tiger eye gem clatters to the floor beside him as Phineas forces his way through the figure's dark aura to get to his brother, an inferno of rage erupting inside his chest. He stands to face the demon, which smiles as it mocks him for staying to die by his brother's side. Spotting the graying trace of twitching mist within the shadows, Phineas orders the demon to give back his brother's breath, and with a rumbling laugh, the deepening darkness dares him to take it. Phineas swings, slashing through the smoke and ash as it separates from itself briefly to avoid most of the attack, before wrapping itself around the weapon and slithering along Phineas's arms and shoulders and neck. It constricts around him, and he wrenches the battle axe from it, tearing through the shadows as that inferno of rage flares inside his chest again. Having freed his weapon, he channels his churning fury into a desperate attack, swinging at the demon's head and driving the blade of the battle axe into one of the figure's serrated horns, snapping it off at the base. The horn clatters across the floor. A surge of pain ripples out of the shadow within the shadows as the darkness lashes out and tangles itself around Phineas's throat again. And by this point his injuries and wounds have weakened him too much to fight it. He strains vainly to hold his breath for another moment, and then his mouth falls open again to scream, and a flood of smoke and ash surges down his throat. He seizes up, his weapon slipping from his hand, and as his feet leave the floor, the voice of the shadows constricting around his mind asks, "Who mourn you, wanderer?" An agonizing wrenching tears at the inside of his chest as his thoughts materialize into an image of his sister, and he whispers her name into a bracing breeze. Damaris becomes suddenly and acutely aware that she has been dreaming as she watches from a corner of this old dining hall, and the shadow says only, "Will she now? Well, I suppose we'll see." Phineas's final breath is forcibly torn from his chest, and the thin wisps of his consciousness falter and fade and fully flicker out of existence. And then he collapses to the stones as the shadows retreat from him, dragging with them a faint, horrifically familiar mist that twitches and twists before snapping free from his throat. A tiger eye gem slips out of his pocket and clatters to the floor, rolls across the stones, and comes to rest next to the one that Horace had dropped, and the shadows swirl calmly for a moment before surrounding the pair of gems. Two graying traces of twitching mist thrash within the deepening darkness, and then they're dragged into the confines of the jewels, swirling with a sickening smolder. The darkness seems to solidify for a moment, taking on a nearly but not quite humanoid form, and the figure turns toward the corner where Damaris finds herself unable to move. It twirls the pair of tiger eye gems between razored fingers that are too long with too many joints, and the fiendish, disfigured face grins out of the swirling shadows at her as a rumbling laugh rolls through the deepening darkness. At which point, Damaris Manning wakes to the soft sounds of the dawn winds drifting across the sands of the Valukaya Desert on the morning of the 1497th day. She spots the 9 foot tall colossus of a woman with disheveled platinum hair still sleeping on the opposite side of the fire, snoring contentedly as an enormous timber wolf curls against her right side. She restokes the fire and starts coffee, and the smell wakes the wolf, and the wolf wakes the woman, and the sun rises over the eastern horizon as the three of them eat breakfast. Then they break down their camp and set out southward, and as they travel the 10 miles back to Zergon Tal, Damaris describes her dream to her companion, Aztred Hillborn. The enormous timber wolf, Delwyn, chases tiny dust devils across the sands, and Damaris expresses with unshakable certainty her belief that her brothers, who've been missing for more than 4 years since they were accused of murder by a half-crazed, half-drunk halfling, have themselves been murdered by some unearthly entity, and more specifically, that their souls have somehow been captured by it. Aztred listens, and she doesn't interrupt, and she considers the various rituals she knows of that are capable of separating the soul of a living creature from its body and imprisoning it within a physical artifact. They encounter nothing significant during their journey, and they reach the edge of the field of pampas grass by midday before arriving at the northern gate of Zergon Tal. And before they go their separate ways by the afternoon, Damaris tells Aztred that she's leaving town the next morning to head south in search of whatever's left of her brothers. She doesn't ask Aztred to accompany her, and she doesn't have to. The Colossus of a woman tells Damaris that she'll meet her at the Wretched Refuse Tavern for breakfast before they set out, and then she and Delwyn head toward her home along the western edge of town. Damaris makes her way in the other direction, returning to her family apothecary to deliver the leaves and flowers and seeds of the dune blossoms that she and Aztred managed to harvest during their time in the sunburned stretch of desert. She has lunch with her parents, during which she gently informs them of her plans to pursue a mysterious lead on the whereabouts of Horace and Phineas, and that starts a bit of a heated argument, as her parents adamantly remind her that she agreed not to go chasing after her brothers when it was clear that they weren't going to be coming back, because they had already lost 2 children and they have no desire to lose a third. Damaris gently insists that the agreement has changed now that she has an idea where to start looking. And after much disagreement and no compromise, she quietly packs her supplies, collects Phineas's notes and sketches of some of the topography of the 2,600 square miles south and east of the town, and rents a room at the Wretched Refuse for the evening. Now, according to the village expansion rules, because Damaris is staying in Zergon Tal overnight, she must carouse in the evening. But I'm actually going to reflavor that because I like the idea that she works at the Wretched Refuse, and that her carousal therefore takes the form of her working the overnight shift when the rowdiest customers tend to gather. So, as darkness descends and the string band fills the room with energetic music, Damaris keeps the ale, mead, and liquor flowing freely, and I'm going to roll a d10 on the carousing table and hope that she doesn't end up like her brothers did. And that's an 8. So we're already better off, I think. On an 8, she's going to meet a patron, so we are much better off. The band plays well past midnight, and the customers get drunker and louder, and a brawl nearly breaks out before being quickly broken up by the Dirkamayan bouncer. And Damaris is completely unflustered by any of it as she happily goes about her job. So now I'm going to roll a d8 on the patrons table, and on a 2, this honestly could not have worked out any more perfectly. At about 2 in the morning, Damaris is approached by a short-haired elven individual wearing an extravagant coat who compliments her on her composure in the face of all of this unruly commotion, and Damaris admits that she enjoys it and prefers it over the boredom of the quiet nights. The individual introduces themselves as Estelle Rothman and invites Damaris to an informal meeting that they're holding in 2 days to gauge interest in forming a sort of society of explorers and adventurers in town. Damaris considers and then declines, explaining that she's leaving town the next morning, and Estelle wishes her well and suggests that perhaps their paths will cross again someday. As the elven individual leaves, a thoroughly inebriated customer crashes into them, spilling most of a tankard of ale down the front of Estelle's extravagant coat. They pause and sigh and continue through the crowd and out the door. Night passes, and Damaris sleeps dreamlessly in her room on the second floor of the Wretched Refuse, and she wakes on the morning of the 1498th day to find Aztred already downstairs eating breakfast. As Damaris joins her, Aztred suggests that they delay their departure by a day because she was invited to an informal meeting being hosted the next evening at the formerly abandoned manor house of Lord Norman Thorne. The building was recently purchased by an elven individual who is looking to form a sort of society of explorers and adventurers in town, and they visited the nightclub, pugilistic arena, around midnight the evening before. They had seen Aztred defeat 6 consecutive challengers and been so impressed by her strength and resilience that they had invited her to this preliminary gathering. Damaris considers and then agrees, intrigued enough by this coincidence to put off their departure. So now they've got an extra day to prepare for their journey. But having already had one heated argument with her parents regarding her intention to search for her brothers, Damaris sees no reason to return to her family's home. So I think they're going to spend the day investigating, just to try to get a sense of where Horace and Phineas might have been heading. Remembering that her brothers had regularly spent a fair bit of their time at the cautionary tale, Damaris and Aztred head across town to that tavern. And I drop my die. And on a 4, they encounter a kind stranger who knows just the person to ask. So I get to roll again. So they get to the cautionary tale around midday, and they get lunch there. And while they're eating at the counter, they strike up a conversation with the felinial bartender, a leopard-spotted mixologist by the name of Play on Words. He admits that he still remembers the day that the twins had been chased out of the tavern by a dozen furious townfolks after a half-crazed, half-drunk halfling had accused them of murder. He explains that one of his most popular servers mysteriously never returned after that day and suggests that they talk to the woman's sister, who lives in the southern neighborhood of the town. Their conversation comes to an end as one of the town's guard arrives at the tavern, and the bartender asks about a prisoner who had apparently escaped from the city dungeon a couple of days before. And Damaris and Aztred finish eating before leaving. They head toward the southern gate, following the tavern keeper's directions to find a modest house matching the description they were given. They meet a woman there who introduces herself as Adele Weiss and confirms that she was Brandy's sibling, and her expression hardens as she admits that she hasn't seen her sister in more than 4 years. On a 2, she doesn't invite Damaris or Aztred in, as she retreats briefly before reappearing at the door with a corundum-bladed dagger in her hand. Damaris and Aztred both hesitate until Adele offers the weapon to them, telling them that it belonged to Brandy and that they're welcome to return it to her if they ever find her. Damaris accepts the dagger, and Adele admits that she took the blade to a mage several years ago in her own attempt to find her sister, and she learned at that time that the weapon had come from beyond the mists of Elfine, where it had been used by generations of a certain Feyrish family to protect their home from incursions by echo-versal entities. The mage had also told Adele that the pen writes in the night, which had lingered with her even after all these years, though it meant nothing to her then or now. She wishes the two of them luck before closing the door, and now I get to roll again, but a d4 this time. They leave the southern neighborhood, and Damaris examines the dagger to find an elaborate Birkanon rune etched into the crossguard. Aztred reminds her that the club where she fights on occasion is called the Night Club, revealing that the establishment is owned by a man named Pennington Wright, though everyone calls him by his nickname of Penn Wright. So the two of them cross town to the nightclub, which is fairly quiet in the middle of the afternoon, and the bartender directs them to the upstairs office where they find the club owner engaged in a heated argument with a fully lucid and mildly threatening halfling that Damaris recognizes as Thaddeus Bradford. The two women stop leisurely outside the door and watch the interaction until Bradford notices them. He pauses for one moment, then points at Penn and tells him to be smart for once. Then he storms out of the room, and Damaris only barely restrains herself from assaulting the man as he pushes past them and heads down the hallway toward the stairs. Penn invites them into the office, and on another 4, he also knows just the person to ask about what they're investigating, so I get to roll yet again. But at least it's going to be a d6 this time. They ask if he remembers anything about Brandy Weiss, and he tells them that she owes him money, because she used to bet on the fights at the club, though she wasn't a very good gambler. Her original debt was 230 gold, which has since risen to 376 gold with 4 years of interest at 18%. Damaris asks if she still has any items that belong to Brandy, and Penn digs through his files for a few minutes before finding a small slip of paper containing the girl's signature below a list of numbers and a few small bloodstains. He explains that the receipt was from a night that Brandy had only barely won a fight against an ogre as a way to clear the debts that she had amassed up until then, before unfortunately building up an entirely new pile of debts. He gives the receipt to Damaris, who asks if he knows where they might find a mage, and he admits that he does. Aztred then asks what the biggest monster Penn can acquire by that evening might be. He grins at that and tells her that the town guard recently captured a two-headed Jotun that had killed several children over the last month. And Aztred's expression hardens as she tells him that she will fight it to the death to clear the rest of Brandy's debts. He considers very briefly before agreeing, then gives them directions to a mage he knows, though he requests that they not reveal that they got the information from him. They leave the club and follow Penn's directions toward the northern neighborhood of town, where they eventually make their way to looks like an enormous oak tree with a handcrafted door built into it. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm actually lifting this idea from the dungeon entrances table because I've got an idea that I really like and I want to see how it's going to play out. So the two of them cautiously approach this handcrafted door built into the trunk of an enormous oak tree, and Damaris knocks, and after a moment they both hear a small click as the door unlatches and creaks inward a few inches. A woman's voice drifts musically out from behind the door, inviting them inside, assuring them that she'll meet with them shortly, and they both look at each other skeptically for a wordless moment. And then they shrug, and they push the door the rest of the way open. And on a 2, a 4, a 5, and a 3, they find a warmly lit landing inside the tree and a circular wooden staircase leading downward below the ground. And they step inside because they're both adventurers, or at least they are now, and adventurers are notorious for letting their curiosity override their sense of self-preservation. They start down the steps, and as they descend, they hear a slow creak and another small click as the door swings gently shut behind them. They continue downward for a few minutes, and Damaris counts out 70 steps before, on 3, 4, 3, and an 11, they reach the bottom and emerge into a wide circular room with a high ceiling, warmed and lit by the gentle flames flickering in a fireplace. The wall is carved from the dirt itself, with twisting roots and vines growing almost artistically along the surface. A hand-woven rug covers most of the stone floor, and an open archway leads to a passage across from the fireplace, with a pitchstone statue of the god Thunar standing in an alcove across from the staircase. They listen to the snapping of the fire for several minutes before an auburn fox emerges from the open archway, cocks its head at them, blinks, and then turns back down the hall. They look at each other skeptically for a wordless moment, and then they shrug, and they cross the room and follow the fox into the passage, where a 1, 2, 6, and a 4. I get to roll twice for exits, as this doorway leads to an uncomfortably narrow corridor. So that's 5, and another 5. So the passage actually ends at an intersection with halls curving away to the right and the left, each of them falling away into another staircase about 15 feet from the junction. On odds, the fox went left. On evens, it went right. And that's a 78. So they spot the animal's tail as it disappears down the staircase to the right. They squeeze their way down that passage, Astrid struggling quite a bit more than Damaris, both of them getting the impression that this burrow was built by and for someone significantly smaller than a hill giant. They gradually make their way around the curve of the corridor to the stairs and descend again. Damaris counts out another 70 steps before they reach the bottom, where 4, 3, 1, and a 12, they emerge into a sprawling rectangular room with no other apparent exits. The walls here are adorned with dozens of intricate tapestries depicting various scenes of triumphs and tragedies from the interplanar war between the Sanziana and the Huldefolk, and the room is lit by clusters of will-o-wisps hovering near the ceiling like fluttering chandeliers. Damaris and Aztred marvel at the artwork for a few minutes before they spot the auburn fox pawing at a particular tapestry bearing a portrayal of a bloody and brutal battle on an otherwise idyllic hillside beneath an umber sun and a cloudless cerulean sky. Aztred recognizes the scene as the Battle of Yezamin Fiel, but before she can examine it more closely, her attention is drawn to the tapestry beside it, which depicts what looks like a fiendish, disfigured face with a pair of serrated horns curling up and back from its forehead, grinning out of the swirling shadows, as 6 fighters stand against it, one of them holding a book. What catches her eye, however, are 3 of the fighters. A Svartalfar woman that looks suspiciously like a healer she knows from the nightclub, a human woman aiming a longbow who looks uncannily like Damaris, and a woman carrying a wide heater shield on one arm and standing about 9 feet tall with platinum hair that looks almost exactly like her. Then the auburn fox whines as it paws again at the tapestry portraying the Battle of Yezamin Fiel, and Damaris examines it briefly before lifting it away from the wall to reveal a large circular mirror fixed to one of the twisting roots growing across the surface of the dirt. She sees the room reflected in the glass, and she sees herself, an Aztred, and she also sees a Kithrael woman standing immediately behind her. She jumps and spins and finds no one else in the room with them, and she looks back at the mirror to find the woman still standing behind her, grinning and shaking her head. The image of the woman in the glass reaches out and places a hand on the shoulder of Damaris's reflection, and an overwhelming wave of frigid energy washes through her entire body. Then the Kithrael woman in the mirror steps out from behind Damaris's reflection and approaches the opposite side of the glass. And Aztred notices that the auburn fox is sitting in the middle of the room behind them, cocking its head and blinking at them as it watches. Damaris steps toward the mirror and reaches up to the glass, but the Kithrael woman in the reflection twitches back and shakes her head sharply. So Damaris lowers her hand, and the woman in the mirror steps forward again, pointing up toward the 12 o'clock point along the arc of the frame. Damaris looks upward, and in the light cast by the will-o-wisps hovering near the ceiling, she discovers symbols etched in runic characters that she understands. She glances back to Aztred, and they look at each other skeptically for a wordless moment, and then they shrug. And Damaris turns back to the glass, where the Kithrael woman watches her from the other side of the mirror, and she reads the characters etched into the circular frame. Because she's an adventurer, or at least she is now, and adventurers are notorious for letting their curiosity override their sense of self-preservation. She speaks the words, "An ending is the reflection of a beginning, and a beginning is the reflection of an ending." Her words echoing, and she realizes as she does that the sentence leads back into itself to create an infinitely recursive loop. As the words evaporate into the silence of the room, the two of them feel a reverberation in the floor as stone scrapes heavily against stone, and they turn as the ground immediately in front of the auburn fox begins to shift. The animal doesn't move, as four of the tiles in the center of the room slowly slink about a foot and slide away into the floor to create a 10-foot wide opening, revealing another circular staircase. They turn back to the mirror to find only their own reflections, the Kethrael woman having vanished, as if she'd never been there at all. And then they turn back toward the room again to spot the fox's tail as it disappears down the staircase. They don't even bother to look at each other skeptically or shrug this time before following the animal, and they descend further underground for what might be months or might be minutes. They pass sconces glowing with a soft, almost soporific light. Damaris counts out 700 steps before they reach the bottom and find an open archway leading to silence and blackness beyond. As they cross through the archway, the darkness becomes illuminated by the light of thousands of will-o-wisps hovering above them like stars in a clear night sky. And with 4, 1, 3, out of 3, they find themselves on a narrow ledge along one side of a cavernous chasm. A rope bridge with ancient wooden planks stretching out in front of them across the crevasse to another narrow ledge and open archway in the opposite wall. They cautiously make their way across the chasm as a bracing breeze drifts up out of that oddly familiar darkness, and the bridge sways and creaks, but doesn't lose integrity as they slowly cross. The Auburn fox follows, and the three of them safely reach the far side of the cavern, and Aztred has to stoop as they pass through the open stone archway into a dark and narrow tunnel. They continue along the passage for a few minutes as it winds its way deeper into the ground, the walls and ceiling here lined with that same artistically twisting roots and vines growing along the surfaces. And they eventually spot light up ahead as they approach another archway. On a 3, a 1, a 1. Oh no, I dropped. And a 10. The dark and narrow tunnel opens up and out as they emerge into a medium-sized cavern and are startled to find the space filled with a flourishing garden. As they pass through the archway, they realize that it's formed from the roots and the vines, and they continue down a gentle hill into this improbable grove unlike anything either of them have ever seen. At the center of the garden, they find a wide pond, and at the center of the pond, they find a small island with a single yew tree. And near the base of the yew tree, they find what looks like a woman lying on the small island, swirling her fingers in the water with leaves and grasses and flowers in her hair and delicate skin like the bark of a strawberry tree. The woman climbs to her feet as Damaris and Aztred approach, and as she does, the water of the pond rises up as well, swelling on top of itself to form a vaguely draconic figure that churns toward the pair of strangers, hissing at them with the sound of rushing water. Before it can attack, however, the woman on the small island smiles softly and says, "That's no way to greet our guests, Charmin." The creature hisses again, but backs away slightly, remaining between the strangers and the small island, as the woman asks in her dreamy voice, "Why have you come here?" Aztred explains that they were told that she might be able to help them find someone. And the woman asks her, "Did Pennington tell you where to find me?" Aztred claims he didn't, and the woman asks, "Are you lying to me?" Damaris claims they're not, and the woman asks her, "Are you lying to me about lying to me?" Then she laughs with a bright musical sound and takes a step backward toward the yew tree, vanishing behind its trunk as the water hisses again. A moment later, they hear the woman's voice behind them as she says, "You may call me Daphne of the Quercus." They both jump and spin, and the woman laughs brightly again. "Who might I be able to help you find?" Aztred explains that they're looking for Brandy Weiss, and on a 6, damn it, Daphne admits she's never heard the name, but asks if they've got any items that belong to her. Damaris digs out the small slip of paper containing the girl's signature and bloodstains, and the woman takes it, examining it closely before rolling it up tightly and holding it between two fingers just below her face. She smiles softly again and whispers an incantation that causes the slip of paper to ignite with a small flame. Smoke curls off the burning paper in thin wisps, and the woman breathes it in, her eyes fluttering before flashing a vivid cerulean as, on a 5, she says, "Strange and solemn, solitary, searching for the legendary crown of ancient necromancers, asking questions without answers. The one you seek seeks nigh and near, and makes her camp not far from here. In Harapon she stays, and sees the cypress and sequoia trees." Then her eyes flutter again before fading back to their customary hazel, and she holds out the burning slip of paper toward the water weird. "If you wouldn't mind, Jarman." And the vaguely draconic figure obliges by snapping out with its jaws to douse the flame. Damaris and Aztred thank Daphne for her help, and she wishes them luck as they make their way through the improbable grove back toward the tunnel, passing by the auburn fox as it chases a damselfly around the garden. They retrace their path through the caverns and corridors and staircases of this burrow all the way back toward the surface, and as they reach the very first door they initially entered, Damaris notices weathered runes carved into the wooden frame. They flicker faintly as Aztred steps through the door and back out into the early evening air. And then Damaris passes through as well, and she feels briefly lightheaded before the sensation passes. They look at each other, skeptically, for a wordless moment, both of them separately certain that Brandy Weiss is somewhere in the Harapon woods to the east of Zergontal, and neither of them able to remember how they could know that. And then they shrug and head back across town to the nightclub, passing a group of 3 women wearing shimmering blue cloaks along the way and paying them little attention. Now, because they spent the day investigating, and because they're staying in town for the night, Aztred and Damaris are contractually obligated to carouse that evening, and so they return to the nightclub, arriving after darkness has descended, to discover that a group of town guard have already delivered the Jotun to the fight pit. A large crowd has already gathered, and a few preliminary matches are held before the main event. A Dwergen fighter defeats a Durkamayan man. A Samadeva woman defeats a Nakendrian challenger, and an Orcish member of the town guard defeats a Berahinian brawler. And then the fight floor is cleared, and Pennington Wright, who everyone calls by the nickname of Penn, announces that the final match will be a trial by combat to the death between the recently captured Swamp Jotun who had terrorized the town for weeks, and the 9-foot-tall colossus of a woman known as Aztred Hillborn. Bets are placed as she climbs down into the pit, and the hulking monstrosity is shoved through a gate on the opposite side of the floor, and Penn commences the match by hurling a spiked flail onto the ground between the 2 combatants. Aztred and the Jotun both sprint for it without hesitation, and with a 5, Aztred gets there first, skidding in low and grabbing the handle and swinging the weapon to deliver 6 plus 1 for 7 points of damage, dropping the Jotun to 33. On a 2, the Jotun swings a massive fist down on Aztred's shoulder, delivering 7 points of damage back to her, dropping her to 23. On a 6, Aztred regains her bearings and stands, using the momentum to drive the flail into the underside of the Jotun's chin, snapping its head back and inflicting 3 plus 1 for 4, doubled to 8 points of damage, dropping it to 25. Okay. On a 3, the Jotun is so dazed by the impact that it swings wildly, just barely managing to catch the side of Aztred's face and deliver 9, halved to 5 points of damage, dropping her to 19. And then on another 6, Aztred takes the punch, and then she rears back to swing the flail with two hands directly into the left side of this hulking monstrosity's left head, dealing 7 plus 1 for 8, double to 16 points of damage, dropping the Jotun to just 9 as she crushes the side of one of its skulls. On a 2, the Jotun roars out in agony and drives a punch into Aztred's sternum to inflict 3 points of damage, dropping her to 16. And then on a 1, that last hit knocks the wind out of her, and the Jotun charges at her as she stumbles back, driving its remaining head into her for 4, double to 8 points of damage, dropping her to just 8 points. And on a 3, the Jotun connects again, but Aztred manages to catch her balance and shift her weight so that the swing glances off her opposite shoulder, inflicting 10 points, halved to 5, dropping her to just 3 hit points. Come on, Aztred, what do you got? And that's a 6. So Aztred shifts her weight to her left as the Jotun stumbles further forward, and with the full force of her momentum, she swings the flail with two hands again, delivering 5 plus 1 for 6, doubled to 12 points of damage. And because this is a palpable hit, she connects with the right side of this hulking monstrosity's right head, crushing the side of its remaining skull and killing it instantly. Aztred feels blood running down her face as the agony of broken bones radiates sharply through her, and the crowd roars its approval around her. So she spits a mouthful of blood into the dirt, drops the flail onto the back of the dead Jotun, and climbs out of the pits. Damaris immediately rushes to her, leading her to the secluded area of the club where the healer can, according to the book, fix her injuries at the cost of 1 gold per hit point, which is going to be 27 gold, which she can certainly afford given what her portion of the winnings will be as the underdog in that fight. Now for the carousing roll, and I really hope this doesn't go badly because there are some pretty bad options on this table, and Aztred has already had a rough enough night as it is. So that is going to be a 12. And on a 12, they not only gain a new party member, but they gain a free level as well. Though, considering how much damage Aztred took in that fight, I'd hardly call that level free. Now, I do have a little bit of a notion here, so I'm going to roll a d4 now to check something. And that's a 1. So the new party member that they gain is a hermit, which is the archetype that has the healing power. So, what ends up happening is that as the nightclub's healer tends to Aztred's injuries, Damaris is talking about their plan to head south in order to find whatever's left of her twin brothers. And when she mentions that they were twins, the healer asks if they happen to be named Horace and Phineas. Damaris confirms it, and the Svartalfar woman introduces herself as Hope Faulkner, explaining that Horace and Phineas had found her lost in the forest and escorted her into town 4 years ago. She requests to accompany Damaris and Aztred, and they agree. And she asks if they can delay their departure by 1 more day, because she was invited to an informal meeting being hosted the next evening by an elven individual looking to form a sort of society of explorers and adventurers in town. They agree for obvious reasons before returning to the wretched refuse and retiring for the evening. Night passes, and Damaris sleeps deeply, and she dreams of an umber sun against a cloudless cerulean sky, and for a moment there is nothing but soothing silence. She breathes in the humid summer air, and then the silence is swiftly shattered by the soft sounds of the dawn winds drifting across the sands of the Valukaya Desert, and she turns to find herself on the crest of a high dune, looking out over a sprawling auburn landscape. She picks her way down the far side of the crumbling hill to the desert floor, crossing the endless sands for what might be months or might be minutes, until she spots a cluster of dark gray shards of volcanic pitchstone, standing 3 feet tall like the fractured teeth of a slaughtered ogremok. She reaches the nearest stone, examining its rough surface to find the name of Erenor Mithrael, carved in an ancient language that she doesn't understand. She passes that headstone to find another, carved with the name of Tamarin Birch, in flowing Fairish ideograms. And beyond that one, she finds two more pitchstone shards carved with the names that she recognizes as Horace Manning and Phineas Manning. She continues across the deserted cemetery, passing by gravestones inscribed with the names of Aztred Hillborn and Brandy Weiss and Hope Faulkner, of Estelle Rothman and Pennington Wright, of people with names etched in unfamiliar alphabets that she cannot read and does not recognize and will not remember by the time she makes her way back to wherever it is she needs to go. And then she reaches the last stone before the infinite expanse of Auburn Sands, and she believes with absolute certainty that her own name will be carved into the rough surface of the pitchstone. But she is pleasantly perplexed to find instead an ornate and entirely blank headstone. She examines the shard, finding only an intricate keyhole in the center of it, and then she hears the soft sounds of the dawn winds drifting across the desert again, sending tiny dust devils swirling through the cemetery, and she turns to see an enormous timber wolf perched on the crest of a high dune, looking out over the sprawling bronze landscape. And then she finds herself back in the room on the second floor of the wretched refuse, and the same timber wolf lies on the floor beside the other bed, where Aztred sleeps fitfully, as she dreams of a ruined fortress standing on an island of serrated rock in the middle of a glistening lake. She sits in a small skiff that drifts directionlessly on the dark water and marvels at the broken turrets and crumbling parapets of what some call the palace beyond the skies, and some call King's Rest, and some call the sunken castle of the south. What remains of the collapsing structure looms against the churning scarlet sky, a squad of a half-dozen wyverns circling high above the wreckage, and Aztred breathes in the brackish winter air as the dark water lurches beneath her. A massive shadow shifts quickly within the depths, the skiff rising and then dropping again, and a moment later, the surface of the lake erupts as the 30-foot tentacles of a gargantuan monstrosity lash out, entangle the boat, and drag it to the bottom of the lake. And then she wakes on the morning of the 1499th day, and they venture downstairs for breakfast, and they spend most of the day preparing for the journey into unfamiliar territory. As the sun begins to set, they make their way out beyond the eastern gate of Zergontal and along the formerly overgrown trail leading to the summit of Drenin Bren, with Delwyn following at Aztred's side. They find the grounds uncommonly neatened, and many of the buildings in the process of being repaired and refurbished, and the lanterns freshly illuminated, and they head inside to find 19 people in attendance, including themselves. Estelle welcomes Aztred and is delighted to see that Damaris changed her mind, and they make introductions to several of the assembled guests, many of whom Aztred and Damaris recognize. They spend the evening and half the night drinking and mingling, listening to exaggerated stories of previous adventures and sharing plans for future endeavors. They meet a Valkyrian woman named Hirokudari, who neither confirms nor denies the rumor that she intends to become the next port reeve of Zergontal. They meet a retired town guard named Sienna Starfell, and her companion, an orcish blacksmith named Laren Greenwood, who both relocated from the northern regions of Verthavor. They meet a 13-year-old Perficayan courier and composer named Polonius Pickett, who once had something of a reputation around town as a bit of a pickpocket. And Aztred recounts the story of the day that she rescued Delwyn as a wolfling from a pair of trolls and nursed him back to health 4 years ago. By about 2 in the morning, Damaris and Aztred have gravitated to the library with Sienna and Laren, explaining that they'll be heading into the southern reaches of the Doxanath Peninsula the next day, and Damaris describes her dream Damaris describes her dream of the fiendish, disfigured face grinning out of the swirling shadows as it twirled a pair of tiger eye gems that she believes with absolute certainty contain her brother's souls. Laren then reveals that both of his parents had been murdered by a demon 12 years prior during a plague that had wiped out the entire city of Torfstone in a single winter. He requests to accompany Damaris and Aztred in order to help them exact their retribution, and they agree, and Sienna suggests that the group of them meet at the wretched refuse for breakfast before setting out, and they agree. Now, this entire scenario is the result of that 2 I rolled on the patrons table earlier, which states that an NPC, in this case Estelle Rothman, seeks always a robust social life and implores you to attend their next gathering in D4 days. Attending the gathering garners 2 new party members and advancing 1 level, meaning that this party will be setting out tomorrow at level 2, each having gained another 2 hit points and inflicting 2 additional points of damage in combat. Because this was a result of Damaris's carousal roll 2 days ago, I'm going to make another carousal roll for this informal meeting. And that's going to be a 9, which means that I seem to have finally pushed my luck a little too far because a villainous villager attacks, which is the same thing that happened to her brothers 4 years ago. So maybe there's some sort of animosity against the Manning family in the town of Zergontal. So I have to roll a d8 on the villainous villagers table to discover what sort of altercation Damaris and Aztred find themselves drawn into. And that's going to be a 4, which is a religious zealot, which cannot be evaded but will flee if any magic is used in their presence, ending the encounter. Neither of them has any magic items in their possession, but I wonder if either of them have any magical abilities, which isn't strictly by the book, but neither of them having a Timberwolf as a companion. That's an 81, so Damaris definitely doesn't. But Aztred apparently does, which is very interesting. So what happens is that the foundation of the Society of Explorers and Adventurers is established, and the gathering begins to break up. And Damaris and Aztred and Delwyn start making their way back to the wretched refuse. And as they cross town, a shrouded individual emerges from the shadows a few blocks from the tavern. Damaris is entirely oblivious. But unlikely as it is, Aztred actually recognizes the figure's shimmering blue cloak because she remembers seeing 3 people wearing the exact same cloak the day before. The individual moves silently toward Damaris, and Aztred sees moonlight flash off the blade of a dagger as she hears the woman's whispered voice say, "The breath of the first, the soul of the second, the blood of the third." The figure lunges at Damaris, but on a 5, Aztred manages to catch the individual's arm and twist it away. And when she does, she feels a burst of electricity surge through her fingers and into this attacker, inflicting 6 plus 1 for a total of 7 points of what is effectively lightning damage. The figure shrieks in literal shock and attempts to flee. And on a 3, Aztred starts to tighten her grip on the assailant's arm immediately before their body dematerializes in a swirl of cinders and shadow. Aztred searches the street but finds nothing out of the ordinary, so she hastily guides Damaris the last few blocks to the wretched refuse and gets her and Delwyn up to the room and bolts the door. Then she drags a chair across the room and jams it under the doorknob, and they retire for the evening. Night passes, and while it does, I'm going to determine the composition of Damaris' team. I'll start by rolling 4d4 to determine the archetypes of these adventurers, because we already know that Hope is a hermit. So that is 4, a 1, a 4, and another 4. So the party includes a rogue, whose power is automatically disabling any traps the party encounters, and whose weakness is that they avoid combat and let others take a hit. If an attack targets the rogue, I re-roll the attack, and if the attack targets the rogue a second time, then they take the damage. Given that Horace and Phineas were both rogues, this has to be Damaris, who therefore has 12 hit points plus 2 for leveling up twice for a total of 14. The other 3 party members are giants, which I'm going to treat like the fighter class rather than a creature type. Their power is their brute force, which gives each of them an additional point of damage to the party's rolls in combat, and their weakness is that they cannot achieve any result requiring a 4 on an evasion roll, which can only have the same effect as a 3, in which the party escapes freely. They each have 30 hit points, plus 2 for leveling up twice, for a total of 32 each, and these are going to be Aztred Hillborn, Sienna Starfell, and Laren Greenwood. I'm also going to diverge from the rulebook here for a moment, and for the sake of the narrative, because I want to include Aztred's Timberwolf, Delwyn, in the party. He has 8 hit points, plus 2 for leveling up twice, giving him a total of 10. I'm going to roll 5d4 to determine the party's starting gold, which is going to be a 2 for 5 gold, a 4 for 20 gold, a 3 for 10 gold, another 4 for 20 gold, and another 2 for another 5 gold, for a total of 60 gold. I'm going to roll a d6 5 times to determine each adventurer's weapon. So that's a 4 for Damaris, who gets a longbow that inflicts 1d8 of damage. That is a 2 for Aztred, who gets a spiked flail that inflicts 1d10 of damage, and I already know how she gets it. I don't have to roll for hope because she can only wield a mundane quarterstaff that inflicts 1d6 of damage. That's a 3 for Sienna, who gets a longsword that inflicts 1d8 of damage. And that's another 3 for Laren, who also gets a longsword that inflicts 1d8 of damage. As a Timberwolf, Delwyn's Bite does 1d8 of damage. So I'm going to roll a d12 and a d6 5 times each to determine the type and quality of each of their starting loot. And that is an 11 and a 3 for Damaris. So she gets a key that is ancient, meaning that it's worth 2 gold instead of 1. For Aztred, that's a pair of 5. So she gets a shield that's magic, giving her another hit point and meaning that I have to roll a d8 to determine its magical properties, which could go either really well or really badly. So that is a 2, making it clairvoyant, which means that Aztred can use it to choose which party member takes damage during combat. For Hope, it's a 9 and a 2, so she gets a ring that's mundane. For Sienna, that's 3 and a 4, so she has a coin that's ornate, meaning that it's worth 10 times its ordinary value, or 10 gold in this case, which would probably be this world's equivalent of a single $1,000 coin. And for Laren, that is an 8 and a 6. So he gets a book, but I have to roll twice to determine its quality. So that is another 6, so it's trapped, though Damaris is a rogue, so she can disable it, and another 5. So this is also magic. So I have to roll a d8 again to determine its magical properties. And that's going to be an 8, which is an astonishingly beneficial roll. But given Laren's backstory, it also makes an absurd amount of sense. So I'm going to note this down here. And then I will reveal it if and when that time comes. All right, so the many members of this adventuring party wake on the morning of the 1,500th day, and they gather for breakfast at the Wretched Refuse. And Aztred is given a spiked flail by the Durkamayan bouncer, who explains that Pennington Wright left it as a gift for her, along with a small signed slip of paper indicating that all of Brandy Weiss's debts have been settled. Damaris successfully picks the lock on the book that Laren shows her, deactivating a psychic trap within the mechanisms in the process. Having collected Phineas's notes and sketches, she knows that her brothers started out southeastward to retrace the last known steps of a wandering prognosticator who had returned from Fae to deliver an apocalyptic proclamation before promptly dying in the middle of the cautionary tale 4 years ago. But she also knows, or at least she thinks that she knows, that Brandy Weiss has made camp in the Harapan Woods, and so this party of 5, which has a wolf, though not a fox or a Campbell or a Chabert, starts out westward, leaving the relative safety of the town of Zergontal in search of a solemn stranger who is, as far as they seem to have determined, searching for the legendary crown of ancient necromancers. And that feels like just about the perfect place to end this session, which did not go at all as I imagined it would, which is, of course, the beauty of solo RPG. Thank you all for bearing witness to this unconventional adventure, and as always, any comments, questions, or criticisms can go downstairs in the Undercroft. Behave yourselves down there because I will be watching. If you enjoyed this bit of solitary storytelling, feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell to ensure that you'll be among the first to know when new chapters of this unfolding story debut here on Table for One.